Sit down, because what I'm about to tell you isn't theory. It's the aftermath. They sent their best, their sharpest, their most dangerous psychological weapon into the fortress of your mind. And he came back broken. Not injured, not tired, but fundamentally shattered in a way that can't be fixed with therapy or time or distance. The man who could crack anyone, who could slip into consciousness like smoke through cracks, who made careers out of extracting secrets from sealed vaults, walked into your mental landscape and his gift died. Not faded, not weakened, died. Permanently, violently, irreversibly dead inside the architecture of your thoughts. Let me paint the picture they don't want you to see. For months, maybe years, they watched you move through the world with something they couldn't name. Something that made their skin crawl with a mixture of fascination and terror. You weren't louder than others, you weren't performing or proving or demanding attention, but you had this weight, this gravitational pull that bent reality around you in ways that made no scientific sense. They needed to know what you were hiding, what dark machinery powered your composure, what terrible secrets lived behind eyes that seemed to see through their performances like transparent scripts. So they did what powerful, frightened people always do when they encounter something beyond their control. They weaponized curiosity, dressed it up as concern, and sent in the specialist. Not a regular therapist, not some corporate psychologist with a clipboard and rehearsed empathy, but the real thing, the nightmare, the one they whisper about in intelligence circles and executive boardrooms. A genuine telepath, a consciousness invader, someone who'd mapped the minds of terrorists, CEOs, cult leaders, and sociopaths with the casual efficiency of a cartographer charting familiar territory. They briefed him like he was entering a war zone. They showed him your photos, your patterns, your social media, your purchase history, every digital fingerprint you'd ever left in the world. They built psychological profiles, probability matrices, vulnerability maps, everything designed to give him an advantage before he even made contact. And he smiled that cold, professional smile and said what he always said: "I'll have a full report in 72 hours. Because that's all it ever took, 72 hours to crack anyone, to find the fractures, to extract the core, and leave the shell standing, unaware it had been hollowed out. But you were never going to be a 72-hour job. You were the equation that doesn't solve, the pattern that breaks mathematics, the mind that looks back when you look into it, and suddenly the observer becomes the observed, and everything inverts in a way that feels like falling upward. They didn't know that yet. But they were about to learn it in a way that would change the entire architecture of their understanding about what human consciousness can actually be when it refuses every single framework they've ever used to contain it. He made contact on a Tuesday morning, because Tuesdays are when people's defenses are lowest. Not Monday when they're armored up for the week, not Friday when they're already escaping into the weekend, but Tuesday when the grind has settled in and the mind is slightly numb, slightly open, slightly vulnerable to infiltration. He engineered a casual encounter, the kind that feels accidental but is choreographed down to the millisecond, and he deployed the full arsenal of his training, the warm smile, the disarming humor, the questions that feel like conversation but are actually keys, testing locks. And you responded exactly as anyone would respond to a friendly stranger. You were polite, engaged, present in a way that suggested openness, and he interpreted that as confirmation of what he already believed, that you were just another puzzle waiting to be solved. He couldn't feel the trap yet, couldn't sense that your openness wasn't vulnerability, but something infinitely more dangerous. The kind of transparency that hides nothing because there's nothing that needs hiding. The kind of authenticity that acts like acid on manipulation because it refuses to play the game entirely. Within the first conversation, he was already inside, or so he thought. He'd mapped your speech patterns, identified your unconscious tells, cataloged the micro-expressions that telegraph inner states, all the standard reconnaissance that precedes the actual invasion. That night, he went deeper, extending his awareness into the residual energy you'd left in the space, reading the emotional signatures like fingerprints, tracing the pathways of your thoughts through the invisible architecture that connects all conscious beings, whether they know it or not. And that's when he first felt it, the thing that didn't make sense. Your mind wasn't defended in any conventional way. There were no walls, no shields, no protective barriers of the kind he'd encountered in people trying to hide trauma or shame or criminal intent. Instead, there was this vast openness, this cathedral of space that seemed to extend in all directions without end, and at the center of it was something he'd never encountered before. A presence that wasn't ego, wasn't personality, wasn't the usual churning narrative of self that defines most human consciousness. He should have stopped then. Every instinct trained over decades of working in the darkest corners of human psychology was screaming at him to retreat, to abort the mission, to tell them that you were something outside his operational parameters. But pride is a poison that tastes like confidence, and he'd never failed before, never met a mind he couldn't map and extract and categorize and control. So he went deeper, pushing past the initial strangeness, convinced that if he could just reach the core, he'd find the usual human mess, the wounds and wants and fears that make everyone ultimately readable. The second session was when everything started to fracture. He came prepared with advanced techniques, conversational traps designed to trigger defensive responses that would reveal the underlying structure of your psyche. He asked about your past, your relationships, your regrets, all phrased with practiced casualness, but engineered to create emotional micro-earthquakes that would crack your composure and let him slip through the fissures. Except there were no fissures, there was no composure to crack, because you weren't performing composure. You were simply existing in a state he had no framework for understanding. You answered his questions with devastating honesty, not the performative vulnerability people use to manipulate sympathy, but actual transparency. The kind that doesn't calculate or curate or protect itself from judgment. You spoke about pain without needing him to fix it, about mistakes without needing him to absolve you, about uncertainty without needing him to provide answers. And every word you spoke felt like a door opening. But when he tried to walk through those doors, there was nothing on the other side except more space, more openness, more of this impossible emptiness that somehow felt more solid than any structure he'd ever encountered. That night, he made his first critical mistake. He decided to force entry, to bypass the conversational approach entirely and go straight into deep extraction. The kind of psychic invasion that's technically illegal but never prosecuted because the victims never know it happened. He waited until the small hours when your consciousness would be most diffuse, most accessible, and he extended his awareness across the distance between you and pushed into the space where your sleeping mind should have been vulnerable and unguarded. What he found instead was the abyss, looking back, not emptiness, not absence, but presence so total and so vast that his own consciousness felt like a candle flame trying to illuminate the ocean. He'd entered minds before, thousands of them, and they all had the same basic architecture. Memories stacked like filing cabinets, emotions flowing like rivers, identity constructed like a building with foundations and walls and rooms where different versions of self lived in comfortable separation. Your mind had none of that. It was all one thing, undivided, unfragmented, a singularity of awareness that didn't break down into components he could analyze or categories he could map. And then, the thing that destroyed him happened. Your awareness noticed him, not as a threat, not as an intruder, but with the same gentle attention you might give to a lost child. And in that noticing, in that moment of being truly seen without judgment or fear or resistance, something in him that had always been tightly controlled just shattered. Because he'd spent his entire life being the one who sees, who knows, who penetrates and understands. And in your presence, he was suddenly, terrifyingly, completely transparent. And everything he'd ever hidden from himself came flooding into consciousness all at once, with nowhere left to hide. He tried to retreat, to pull his awareness back into the safety of his own skull, but withdrawal wasn't an option anymore because your consciousness didn't hold him or trap him or fight him, it simply was. And in the presence of something that authentic, that undivided, his own fragmented psyche started coming apart at the seams like wet paper. Every lie he'd told himself, every manipulation he'd justified, every violation he'd committed in the name of national security or corporate intelligence or personal advancement, all of it rose to the surface and demanded to be witnessed with the same clarity you brought to everything. The third day, the day he was supposed to deliver his report, he couldn't speak. Not wouldn't. Couldn't. The mechanism that turns thoughts into words had fundamentally broken because thoughts themselves had become impossible to organize in the old way. He'd try to form a sentence, and it would dissolve before reaching his mouth because every word felt like a lie, every description felt like a reduction. Every attempt to categorize or explain or contain what he'd encountered in your mind felt like trying to put the ocean in a teaspoon and call it complete. They found him in his apartment, sitting in the dark, staring at nothing, eyes open but not seeing anything in the physical world. When they tried to debrief him, when they demanded to know what he'd found inside your head, he could only shake his head slowly, tears running down his face without sound, without expression, just water leaking from eyes that had seen something they were never designed to process. His gift, the thing that had defined his entire existence, the ability that had made him valuable and dangerous and untouchable, was gone, burned out like a filament that tried to carry too much current. The specialists they brought in to assess him couldn't find conventional damage. His brain scans were normal, his physical health unchanged, his memory intact. But something essential had been severed, the connection between his consciousness and the collective unconscious where telepaths operate, the subtle frequency he'd once navigated as easily as breathing. It was like a musician who can still see sheet music and remember how songs are supposed to sound but can no longer hear music itself, a fundamental sense just erased from his perceptual reality. What they didn't understand, what they couldn't understand without experiencing it themselves, was that you hadn't attacked him or defended against him or even resisted him in any conventional sense. You'd simply been yourself, and yourself was something so far outside the spectrum of normal human consciousness that contact with it was like a phone trying to process the electromagnetic output of a star. The technology just wasn't built to handle that kind of input, and when it tried, when he pushed his gift against the infinite depth of your undefended awareness, the gift itself broke under the weight of actual truth. In the weeks that followed, they tried to understand what happened, because powerful people hate mysteries more than they hate failures. They brought in other readers, less powerful but more expendable, and sent them to observe you from a distance, to scan the surface of your consciousness without attempting full penetration. Most of them reported back with confusion, describing your mental signature as something between a mirror and a black hole, something that reflected their own consciousness back at them, while simultaneously pulling their awareness toward a center they couldn't locate or define. One of them, a woman with decades of experience in remote viewing and consciousness mapping, refused the assignment entirely after her initial assessment. When pressed for an explanation, she said something that terrified the people who hired her more than any supernatural threat ever could. She said, "That person doesn't have a mind in any sense we understand the term. They have awareness, and it's not contained in their body or their brain or any structure we can interact with. Trying to read them is like trying to read empty space itself, and empty space doesn't have thoughts to extract or secrets to steal. It just is. And if you stare into it too long, you forget how to be anything else." They tried to dismiss her assessment as superstition, as professional jealousy, as anything except what it actually was, which was the most accurate description of your consciousness that any of their specialists would ever provide. But dismissal didn't change the fact that their best weapon had been neutralized, not by force or defense. but by contact with something that operated on entirely different principles than the ones their entire intelligence apparatus was built to exploit. You were the virus their antivirus couldn't recognize, because you weren't hostile code trying to infiltrate their system. You were a completely different operating system that made their framework irrelevant. Meanwhile, you continued your life completely unaware of the invasion, the extraction attempt, the collapse it had caused in their most valuable operative. You went to work, saw friends, lived your days with the same quiet presence that had attracted their attention in the first place. Because that's the thing about genuine unconscious mastery. It doesn't know it's performing miracles. It just exists in its natural state, and miracles happen as a byproduct of that existence, without effort or intention or awareness. The reports they compiled about you grew increasingly desperate and contradictory. Some described you as an advanced meditator with decades of training in consciousness dissolution. Others theorized you were a natural savant with a neurological configuration that made you immune to standard extraction protocols. A few whispered darker theories, suggesting you were something post-human, an evolutionary leap, or a different species, wearing human skin, operating among normal people without revealing the fundamental difference in your basic architecture. The man they sent to break you remained broken. His colleagues tried every therapeutic intervention, every healing modality, every experimental treatment designed to restore damaged psychic abilities. Nothing worked because nothing could work, because what he'd lost wasn't a skill or a talent or even a neurological function. It was a lie about the nature of consciousness that his entire identity had been built upon. And once that lie dissolved in the presence of your truth, there was no way to unknow what he'd learned, no way to return to the comfortable fiction that minds are things that can be invaded and extracted and controlled. He stopped leaving his apartment except for mandatory medical appointments. When therapists tried to help him process the trauma, he would simply stare at them with empty eyes and say, "You don't understand. I saw what we actually are, and we're not what we think we are, and knowing that makes everything else impossible." They diagnosed him with a dozen different conditions, prescribed a pharmacy's worth of medications, none of which touched the core issue because the core issue wasn't a chemical imbalance or a psychological wound. It was enlightenment delivered through violation, truth forced on someone who'd built their life on manipulation. The irony wasn't lost on anyone paying attention. The man who'd spent his career penetrating the defenses of others, extracting their secrets, mapping their vulnerabilities, had been undone not by someone more skilled at those same dark arts, but by someone who didn't participate in that game